We currently live in an age which proudly proclaims to be the most advanced, the most humane, the most freedom and liberty loving, and the most caring for human life in general. Sure, our era isn't perfect. However, compared to past eras, it's however, reality is often far more complicated. Although arguably much progress has been made for human liberty and the value of human life, it still remains the case that oftentimes people still not only dehumanize, but actively don't humanize the experience and suffering of other people. It's a common problem that can be seen across the political spectrum, where people are constantly dehumanized and their very valid human experience and suffering is constantly denied. There's a very pertinent quote in this regard that can be found in the introduction to the brilliant Dr. Carol Quigley's excellent work, Tragedy and Hope. In this work, in the introduction, the quote is as follows: "The apathy and indifference of people in the Western world to the suffering, torture, misery, bondage, and death of millions and millions of people around the world in the years ahead may be one of the greatest tragedies of the 21st century." This points out a very obvious and very pertinent, yet covered up human reality that we often dehumanize and tend to actively deny the very valid human experience of either our political opponents or those who we disagree with, or of people that we simply, unfortunately, don't happen to care about particularly, which is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the 21st century. Many series and many works have discussed the politics of dehumanization and how dehumanization is very common in the political scene and also within other areas such as the religious scene, or how tribalism and nationalism can also lead to dehumanization. I think one series which deals with dehumanization and the politics of dehumanization very nicely is Attack on Titan. Yes, I am shamelessly referencing the anime slash manga series, but it does an excellent job in depicting how not only people end up dehumanizing each other, but how easy it is and how naive people are in accepting narratives which can lead to the dehumanization of others. It also does a very good job in contextualizing why people who are often dehumanized or why people who are often going through a lot of oppression and suffering, why they tend to commit perhaps sometimes the worst atrocities themselves as well. This raises a very pertinent point as well, which is the issue of the colonizer and the colonized. I think it's fair to say that whilst the right goes way too far in justifying the oppression of the colonizer, the left can sometimes downplay the personal responsibility that the colonized have. In other words, the right go too far in defending the colonizer, whilst the left can go too far in defending the colonized. There's another issue within modernity, which is the abdication of responsibility. The abdication of responsibility in modernity essentially allows for this kind of dehumanization and this kind of rhetoric which actively vilifies people as barbaric others. There's also a very interesting phenomena in modernity, which is that not only do we actively dehumanize our opponents, whether they be political, ideological, religious, or tribal, but we also actively do not humanize them. It's a very subtle difference, but one that can be appreciated. You see, in pre-modernity, they would actively dehumanize their opponents, ideological or political. For example, during the Crusades, the Christians of that time might have argued that the Jews and Muslims in living in Arab or Islamic lands were barbaric, or they'd taken over the Holy Land and we were just recovering the Holy Land from the infidels. And Muslims, in their conquests of, for example, Christian lands, might argue that, well, these people are infidels, we have the right to take over their land. Again, extremists on both sides do not reflect the actual religions, neither do they reflect the teachings that the prophets of these respective religions brought. But oftentimes, people who fall into extremism use religion as a justification for their oppression and dehumanization. However, in modernity, there's a very interesting phenomenon, which is that we actively do not humanize our opponents or people that we simply don't happen to care about. It's a very subtle difference here, but the difference between the two is that the first starts from the premise that the other side is fundamentally human. Of course, if you view the other side as fundamentally human, that raises difficulties in regards to oppressing them or treating them with discrimination. Because if they are human, they're entitled to the same basic rights as everybody else. So what dehumanizing narratives do is they give justification to the by portraying the other side as a barbaric other, you essentially dehumanize them and view them as less than human. Therefore, they are not worthy of the same rights that you have. However, when you actively do not humanize somebody, which is especially true for the modern era, it seems that you don't even start off with the basic assumption that they are human in the first place. Rather, you are just indifferent to their suffering and you hold a neutral stance to their suffering. And this is why this quote from Tragedy and Hope is so important, because it reflects a shift from genuine hatred for other people to genuine indifference to their suffering, which is perhaps even more of an evil phenomenon than actively dehumanizing others. There's various reasons why we don't actively humanize other people. The Industrial Revolution made it so that people viewed other people as simply cogs in a greater industrial machine. And Marxists such as Karl Marx, they discuss how people are alienated from the product of their labor, therefore they aren't in line with their true selves, and their work is fundamentally unfulfilling in an industrial system. Thus, you know, industrial society treats people not even as human to begin with, but rather as cogs in a machine. Ironically, though, these same issues that occur in capitalist industrial society, and in which Marxists are very correct in pointing out them. However, these same issues occur within Marxist or communist societies. It seems that this issue tends to be an issue of modernity and modern industrial societies as a whole, and isn't simply specific to capitalism. Also, the phenomena of secularization, rationalization, and the rise of materialism since the Protestant Reformation have made it so that the world appears as a more mechanical and rationalistic place. And it makes it so that this attitude of the ends justify the means type of attitude is more prevalent in our society, and the basic value of human life and basic morality is thrown out the window. And we can see this especially within the modern political spectrum, where Marxists and leftists will accuse conservatives of being Nazis or people who just hate everybody, and conservatives would accuse leftists of being dirty commies. Again, all of this simply serves to dehumanize the other side and treat them as a barbaric other. And this kind of rhetoric very easily leads to oppression, dehumanization, and suffering of the supposedly barbaric other. We can also see this in a dozen other places, this process occurring in real time. For example, in America, the political spectrum is now so polarized that each side accuses the other of being Nazis or dirty commies or this or that. And it's very easy then to justify oppression. Because if the other side is just barbaric people who want to kill you, then why not just kill them first? And we see this taking place in a dozen other places around the world. For example, in Palestine, we see how the Israelis, using indeed the very horrible incident of October the 7th, they use that as an excuse to collectively punish and carpet bomb 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. And they used dehumanizing genocidal language to describe the Palestinians. For example, using the word Amalekites for them, referencing the Old Testament incident where the Amalek people were slaughtered by the Hebrews. There's also a lot of pertinent sociological work in this regard. For example, in many cases, what oppressive governments and regimes often do is they oftentimes deny the genocide. They will deny oppression of other people, or if they don't deny it, they will say that it is justified, or if they don't say it is justified, they will argue over the minute details, thus distracting from the bigger picture, which is the fact that they did carry out said oppression. Also, the study of the authoritarian personality is very pertinent. It shows that normal, everyday people who otherwise wouldn't be hateful oftentimes commit genocide, commit oppression, commit unimaginable atrocities out of obeying the state. In other words, they commit crimes of obedience. Why do I talk about all of this? The reality is that if we attempt to reform our system so as to prevent said oppression, and if we attempt to help other people, we can make a very real difference. We shouldn't fall for this deterministic attitude of, oh, we can't make a difference and nothing will ever work, because this ignores the fact that we are social actors with free will that can shape the world. Humans have shaped history in unimaginable ways throughout history, and so we have a duty to stand up for what's right. As is mentioned in the introduction to Dr. Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, if all our efforts resulted in saving just one life, wouldn't it be worth it? What if we could save 100 lives? What if we could save 1,000 lives? What about 10,000 lives? What about 1 million lives? What if we could free the billions of inhabitants of Tibet, China, Russia, and other communist nations and ensure the survival of the people of Taiwan and Israel? Would not all our efforts be worth it? I believe so. The tragedies occurring today in Russia, China, Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Western Europe, or the Middle East could be avoided. Indeed, we could prevent much human suffering, and we could prevent much conflict and war if we attempted to defend other people, defend their rights, and protect them from the possible suffering that could occur. Of course, we can acknowledge that the world is a place of brutal Darwinistic competition, and things do go wrong, but we still have a moral duty to try our best in the dark times.